Sale at Perlis happens once a year. Now 20 to 50% off quality summer clothing at Perlis in New Orleans and in Mandeville.
For a limited time at Metairie Bank, new auto loans at 6.25% simple interest for 36 months with 20% down at Metairie Bank, the bank of personal service. For a good rate and fast approval on a home loan, call Metairie Bank. For a good rate and fast approval on a commercial real estate loan, call Metairie Bank, the bank of personal service.
Ford buyers, the time is now. Come see for yourself why we're one of the fastest growing Ford dealers in the South.
Make way to Regency Ford today and save with huge cash discounts on a 99 Expedition loaded with dual air, automatic, third seat, power windows and locks, the works, just $26,999. Or a tough 99 F-150 Super Cab, complete with air, AM/FM stereo, chrome rear bumper, and more for only $14,999. If you've been wanting a new Ford but keep putting it off, what were you thinking? Hurry now to Regency Ford on Veterans Memorial in Metairie.
This is CNN. This is a special report from CNN. In the midst of national mourning, the solace of memories. John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife Carolyn are gone, but they will not be forgotten. He was the most favored son of a political dynasty, the boy a country watched grow up. She was the golden girl who won his heart. Their ashes have already been committed to the sea, at a site not far from where they and Lauren Bissett died. That return evoked the words of President Kennedy in 1962.
We have salt in our blood, in our sweat, in our tears. We are tied to the ocean. And when we go back to the sea, whether it is to sail or to watch it, we are going back from whence we came.
In the Manhattan church, once attended by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, John and Carolyn Bissett Kennedy's lives and love are being remembered today in a private mass. Here now from New York, Bernard Shaw, Judy Woodruff, and Jeff Greenfield.
Hello, and we welcome an international audience to our special coverage. At this hour, the Kennedy family is once again drawing on one of its most painfully reinforced lessons. There is indeed strength in numbers.
The family, numbering in the dozens and spanning several generations, is gathering for a private memorial service that will also be attended by President Clinton and the First Lady. They have arrived in New York at JFK Airport. The Kennedys are stressing that this Mass will celebrate the lives rather than languish in the loss of John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife Carolyn Bissett Kennedy.
Today's service will be held, as we said, at the Church of St. Thomas More in Upper Manhattan. It is a place that provided a spiritual haven for Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Today, it will be a refuge of sorts for the whole Kennedy family. Only about 350 invited guests will be permitted inside. The crowds of public mourners are lining the streets outside. CNN's Chris Black joined us with more. Chris.
Judy, the relatives and closest friends of John and Carolyn Kennedy are gathering here in Manhattan at St. Thomas More Church. As you noted, this is a very small church. It only seats 350 people, but the choice was quite deliberate. Family associates say that Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg, John's older sister and his closest surviving relative, was adamant that this be as private and normal a service as possible. She wanted this to be a final gift to her brother, who often found it difficult to find privacy in life. Although President Clinton, his wife Hillary Rodham Clinton, his daughter Chelsea will be among the mourners, you will not see a lot of prominent, well-known people, except those who had a special connection to John or Carolyn Kennedy. Muhammad Ali just arrived at the church. Former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara has come to the church. But again, Robert McNamara was very close to John's mother, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, particularly after the death of President Kennedy. John, you will see a lot of Kennedy relatives. John Jr. has 26 surviving first cousins, and they have 54 children, and that's just on the Kennedy side. He was very close to his cousins on his mother's side, to the children of Lee Radziwill, Tony and Caroline. The Bissetts also will have a lot of relatives here at the church today and a lot of close friends. Family associates say that the two families have been working together very closely on the guest list and also on the liturgy that will be followed today. There will be 3 Catholic priests. The presiding priest is Father O'Byrne, who was presided yesterday over the committal at sea. The service also will involve the participation of close friends and relatives. This is very characteristic. At previous Kennedy family funerals, family members have been involved in doing readings and also in offering the gifts at the Eucharist part. Senator Ted Kennedy will give one of the eulogies. Senator Kennedy has played this role frequently in the past for other family members, most notably when his brother Robert, the senator from New York State, was assassinated in 1968. The other eulogy will be delivered by Hamilton South, who is representing the Bissett Freeman family. The Kennedys are quite concerned about being involved in this service. They very much love their cousin John, and you will see their active participation. It was very noteworthy yesterday that Senator Kennedy himself insisted upon carrying the remains of his nephew aboard the ship where the committal at sea took place. When President Kennedy died in Texas in 1963, his brother Robert would not leave the side of his coffin. When Robert was killed 5 years later, his friends and relatives maintained a vigil at St. Patrick's Cathedral so that he would never be left alone. It's very characteristic of the family. We will see more of that today. Judy?
Chris, we want to point out that we're now looking at Robert Kennedy Jr., his wife Mary Richardson, arriving at the St. Thomas More Church. Chris, who decided on the service today? Who made the important decision?
It was my understanding from family associates, Judy, is that it was very much a collaborative process. The key decision makers in the Kennedy family were Senator Kennedy and Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg, but they were consulting very closely with the Bissett and Freeman family. So it was basically a collaborative process, but there are some Kennedy family traditions. They always have readings, they always have active participation of loved ones, they always have a eulogy by the senator, though when Michael Kennedy, John's cousin, died less than 2 years ago, his brothers Joe and Bobby took over that role. It was an interesting change, a sign that the second generation was old enough to carry out that duty to a lost one. Judy?
All right, Chris Black, who is just outside the St. Thomas More Church. Bernie?
Police have set up a ring of security around this church, setting up barricades, closing parking garages, and they're also advising people in the neighborhood to stay inside. CNN's Gary Tuckman has a view from the street.
That's right, Bernie. The St. Thomas More Church is near and dear to the hearts of the Kennedy family. The church here on Manhattan's Upper East Side is just a few blocks away to my right, where John F. Kennedy Jr. spent most of his childhood. Now, the late Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis did go to this church very often, and she often brought her daughter Caroline and her son, John Kennedy Jr. Now, it is the church that a lot of happy things have happened for this family. There was the christening of Caroline's 3 children, but there have also been some sad stories. I'm going to move my microphone up a little bit. It's a little hard to hear me. Move it up a little bit. The funeral of Stephen Smith, Jeannie Kennedy Smith's husband, was held here. Now, the church is named after Thomas More. Thomas More was a 16th century Englishman who was executed after not recognizing Henry VIII as the Protestant leader of England. Interestingly enough, this church was built as an Episcopalian church, a Protestant church, back in 1870. It only became a Catholic church 49 years ago in 1950, so the St. Thomas More Church is about to celebrate its 50th anniversary as a Catholic church. One thing we would like to point out, this is not an official funeral mass, this is a memorial mass, because in the Catholic faith, if we do not have the remains of the deceased in the church with you, we cannot have a funeral mass, so this will be considered a memorial mass of this church. Right now, people are lining up on both sides of the street, members of the public, but as soon as they get here close to the church, the police are telling them to move on. They don't want anyone in the way. They'll be closing off 5 square blocks surrounding the St. Thomas More Church as it gets closer to 11 o'clock, the beginning time of this memorial mass. Bernie, back to you.
Thank you, Gary. Our CNN analyst, Jeff Greenfield, is here with us as we continue our special coverage.
Morning. We're going to be hearing a lot today about the greater meaning of this and the political past and present and probably future of the Kennedy family. I just want to remind us of the unhappy basic fact that it was captured by a great Irish writer named Sean O'Casey, who wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, children should bury their parents. Parents should not bury their children. This is yet another example of where an older generation of Kennedys is having to confront the sudden death of someone in their family decades before their time. In John Kennedy's generation, 4 people died young: John, Robert, Joe Jr., and Kathleen. 2 of Robert Kennedy's children already dead, and now John F. Kennedy Jr. At root, when you get past all the mythology and all the politics and all the greater meaning, that's still what's going on here. And while it is a celebration, as we're going to be hearing later, this is also the fundamental fact of what's going on here today.
And Jeff, this is a family that's done it both ways. I mean, you've had the young having to bury the old. Rose Kennedy, just a matter of a few years ago, she was, what, 102? You've had certainly President John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, their children all involved. But we've also seen the services, the funerals you just mentioned.
And I was reading last night the account of Robert Kennedy's funeral train in 1968, and how much of what we're talking about in this incident was reflected back then 30 years ago. The number of people that came to stand by the tracks as that train took 8 hours to get from New York to Washington, and people saying over and over again, I just felt I had to be there. People feeling connected up with something larger than just the death of one young man, but because in part of what this family represents.
This is a private memorial mass, but we can tell who is entering as they go in. We've seen John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist and author, Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, Lee Radziwill, the sister of the late Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy, and I think we saw, as you mentioned, John Siegenthaler.
John Siegenthaler, an old associate of the Kennedys, Robert Kennedy from Justice Department days, and then a great newspaper editor who's been close to the family for 3.5 decades.
Now in the Freedom Forum.
Mm-hmm. So you do have, in this sense, 2 things going on at once. The fundamental fact of the premature, terrible death of 3 young people, and a kind of panorama going back 4 decades through American political life. And I guess it's that mix that is so compelling for people.
Mm-hmm. Our coverage from New York City will resume in just a moment.
Why do we follow Coronado in his quest for gold? Simple. Years from now, when Y2K fears mount, Russia's economy tanks, and internet PE ratios become surreal, investors who put some assets in gold will, in effect, insure their portfolios. So today, we take the gold for them to buy. Oh.
From now on, your nights will never be the same. Introducing Sprint Nickel Nights.
I've got some great news.
Yeah, I'm listening.
Oh, this better be good. Well, tell me.
You can stay in touch for just 5 cents a minute every night.
That is good.
You're not going to believe it.
That's right. Talk long distance every night for just 5 cents a minute.
Uh-huh. I know.
What's the number?
Call 1-800-PIN-DROP, and calls from home every night are just 5 cents a minute.
You serious?
Finally.
And with Sprint, every night is a nickel night. After work, after dinner, talk every night for just 5 cents a minute.
You like to talk, don't you, boy?
So what's the deal?
Sprint Nickel Nights. Switch now, and calls are 5 cents a minute every night. You don't want to sleep on this offer.
That's what I'm saying.
Call 1-800-PIN-DROP or visit the Sprint store at Radio Shack. Get Sprint Nickel Nights now.
I believe in taking the time to do right. Because it's a lot faster than being wrong.
Because it's a lot faster than being wrong.
I believe opportunity is the most perishable resource.
I believe opportunity is the most perishable resource. Hace tiempo para estar en lo...
I believe bankers get more done than banks.
I believe integrity doesn't hinder performance. It is performance.
I believe in taking my clients seriously and myself less so.
Creo que la integridad
no obstaculiza el rendimiento. À mon avis, je n'aurai pas toujours la solution, mais je réussirai à la trouver.
I believe we are driven to succeed because we are unwilling to fail.
I work for JP Morgan.
I work for JP Morgan.
Trabajo en JP Morgan.
I work for JP Morgan.
Minutes away from a celebratory mass in New York, this city's outpouring of grief has triggered an avalanche of flowers and notes on the doorstep of the apartment that was shared by John Kennedy Jr. and his wife. Deborah Fayerick joins us now from the Tribeca neighborhood. Deborah, you're what? How many blocks from this church?
Well, we're about 100 blocks south of the church. There was a ceremony yesterday. That was a little closer to here in this neighborhood. But let me tell you about the mood here. It is really one of disbelief. So many people feel it's unreal that John and Carolyn Kennedy could have left this very apartment building just a week ago, getting ready for a weekend away. Little did they know that they would never be returning, that once they put the lock in the door, it would be for the last time. And the feeling among many people here is that these three beautiful, talented people are now ashes in the ocean, and that's what's so hard for many to come to grips with. There's a sign that really sums it up. It says how fragile we are. Police, as you can see, have not closed off the street, and so that's why you're seeing all those trucks, and that's why it sounds actually much louder than it is. We are joined right now by Robert Haber. You came down to look at this memorial. When you looked into that memorial, what did you see?
I was actually in disbelief. I've been watching on TV and reading in the paper, and I had no idea the impact it would have on me when I actually came down here. I didn't even mean to come down here. I stumbled on it, and in retrospect now, I'm really glad I did, because it's had quite an impact on me this morning.
What is it that jumps out at you? What sort of struck your heart?
Well, what struck out for me the most is my own mortality. You know, John and I were very close in age, 3 weeks apart. And it just hits me that how precious life really is, and how short our time here really is, and, you know.
Was it a flower? Was it a sign? I saw you choking back tears earlier.
I think it was the flowers. I think it was the passion when you read all the cards and all the posters and what people have left here and the impact.
Deborah, we are interrupting your interview to show you, our audience, once again, the front of St. Thomas More Church. I believe that was Sergeant Shriver and Eunice Shriver emerging from a limousine, and other members of the Shriver family. Eunice Shriver, of course, being one of the sisters of President John Kennedy. This is the family, again, very much touched, as all the Kennedy family has. Their daughter, Maria Shriver, very close to Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg.
Chris Black is outside this magnificent church. Chris?
Bernie, Senator Kennedy has played a very key role for the last week in keeping the family together. He's the patriarch of this family. He left Hyannisport early this morning and flew to New York and went to the apartment of his sister, Patricia Lawford. On returning to the burial at sea yesterday to the family compound, family associates tell me that the senator spent most of the evening working on his eulogy. I'm told that the eulogy will be a very moving tribute to his nephew, who was very much like a surrogate son to him. Earlier this week, Senator Kennedy issued the only statement that has come from the family since John Kennedy, his wife, and his sister-in-law died in a plane crash off the coast of Martha's Vineyard last week. In his statement, the senator said, "We are filled with unspeakable grief and sadness by the loss of John and Carolyn and of Lauren Bissett. John was a shining light in all our lives and in the lives of the nation, in the world that first came to know him as a little boy. He was a devoted husband to Carolyn, a loving brother to Caroline, an amazing uncle to her children, a close and dear friend to his cousins, and a beloved nephew to my sisters and me. He was the adored son of two proud parents whom he now joins with God. We loved him deeply, and his loss leaves an enormous void in all our lives. John had many gifts and gave us great joy, most especially when he brought his wonderful bride, Carolyn, into our lives. They had their own special brand of magic that touched everyone who knew and loved them. We are thankful for her life and for their lives together." We love Carolyn and share in the grief of the Bissett and Freeman families at the tragic loss of both Carolyn and Lauren. Carolyn and Lauren were exceptional and accomplished young women who reflected the extraordinary qualities of their family. The Bissett and Freeman families will always be in our thoughts and in our prayers.
And Chris, we just saw the Smith family entering this church, William Kennedy Smith, Jean Smith. One thing about this church, I want to take you back 45 years ago. You alluded to the Shrivers, you alluded to Patricia Kennedy, Lawford. She was married in this church. Patricia Kennedy was married to Peter Lawford in 1954. The maid of honor was Jean Kennedy Smith, and guess who the ushers were? John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Robert Francis Kennedy, and Edward Moore Kennedy. Ethel, Jackie, they were gathered here. Eunice Shriver was back in Chicago at the time in 1954, expecting her first child. Chris?
This is, Bernie, before we go back to Chris, I'm told this is Joan Bennett Kennedy, the former wife of Senator Edward Kennedy, and the son that she had with Senator Kennedy, U.S. Representative Patrick Kennedy, who, of course, was with the senator when they went out on the ship 2 days ago as the remains of John Kennedy and his wife and sister-in-law were brought up. Now to Chris Black. Also, Chris, you are at the church.
Yes, Judy, and we were talking about this, the only public statement that has come from the Kennedy family since John Kennedy Jr., his wife Carolyn, and his sister-in-law Lauren died last week. That statement came earlier this week from Senator Edward Kennedy, who's the patriarch of this family and has really been the spokesman for the family throughout this tragedy. That statement, a part of the statement, said, "At this most difficult time, we rely on our faith in God. We are more grateful than we can ever say for the support of our family, our friends, and for so many of our fellow Americans who opened their hearts to John. We also thank, in a very special way, the men and women who have worked so well and long and hard in these past days to find John, Carolyn, and Lauren. We will never forget the dedication, the professionalism, and the sensitivity that they have shown. We pray that John, Carolyn, and Lauren will find eternal rest, and that God's perpetual light will shine upon them." It's interesting, Judy, that the senator ended his public statement with those who...
Senator Chris, we see Senator Edward Kennedy now coming into the church with his wife, Victoria. As we said just a moment ago, his former wife, Joan Bennett Kennedy, had entered. They, of course, are parents of 3 children, Patrick, Teddy Jr., and Kara Kennedy. We're still about 40 minutes away from the beginning of this celebratory Mass, and many of the people, the approximately 350 people we're told invited, are still arriving. Chris, we're going to continue to interrupt you, but we do want to hear what you have to say.
Judy, the family will be celebrating a Mass of the Resurrection. This is a Mass that Catholics celebrate at funerals. And I understand that the altar is decorated with white roses and white lilies of the valley and ferns. This is a time for the family to try to seek some solace in their religion and draw some strength from one another. The death of John Jr. and his wife and sister-in-law was a terrible shock to this family. They've been gathering at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport for a family celebration. The wedding of Rory Kennedy, his cousin, the youngest child of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, who was to have been married Saturday night. That wedding, of course, has been postponed indefinitely. So the family went from great joy, from a very happy rehearsal dinner on Friday night, to the depths of grief on Saturday when they realized their cousin was lost. This has been this is the second death of a member of this generation for this family in less than 2 years. Michael Kennedy, John Kennedy Jr.'s cousin, who was a child of Ethel and Robert Kennedy, died in a skiing accident on New Year's Eve 1998. And the cousins, I'm told by family associates, are finding it particularly difficult to lose a peer. Judy?
Chris Black, we are continuing to watch the scene outside St. Thomas More Church. As we said, this church sits on 89th Street in Upper Manhattan, between Park and Madison Avenues. It is the church that John Kennedy Jr.'s mother the former First Lady regularly attended services at after she moved to New York City in the mid-1960s. And she had lived only a few blocks away from here at 84th Street and 5th Avenue. This was her church. And no doubt this is the reason that Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg and other members of the family involved in this decision selected it. It is smaller than the church where Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, where her services were held just, 4 years ago in 1995. It is a church that was originally, I believe we've said, an Episcopal church. It became a Catholic church about 50 years ago. And as Bernie just said, some important moments in the Kennedy family have taken place inside this building.
Jeff, Springfield is very basic, but we can indeed be very thankful for this wonderful, although hot weather this morning.
Yeah, sometimes I think in an effort to link up weather conditions with greater things, we will ascribe meaning to it. If it rains, we'll say it's an unhappy day. If it's sunny, we'll say in marked contrast to the mood. There's one other point I think worth making, because I think those of us who watch people gathered outside the Kennedy apartment or outside this church for hours on end, we sometimes may wonder why. And we've been talking to a couple of people about this, psychiatrists, anthropologists, about this basic need. And one of the points they make, and I think it's very relevant, is that when a traumatic death like this occurs, obviously we grieve for the victims and their families. We also grieve for ourselves, because it's a really shocking reminder of mortality, that when someone's so good-looking and so powerful, connected with such a family, if it happens to them, it can happen to all of us. And one person made this point to us that when someone stands outside the home, leaves a flower, leaves a note, makes some kind of, ties a yellow ribbon around a tree, it's a way of gaining some kind of power over an event that makes us all feel powerless. And that's, I think, as we watch what happens today, and as we've watched this past week, I think that's an answer to that question.
Jeff, we want to point out Senator John Kerry, who is the junior senator from Massachusetts, has arrived, going in now. This is Ethel Kennedy, of course, the aunt, Joe Kennedy, former congressman from Massachusetts. And I believe I saw one of the other children of Ethel and Bobby Kennedy, Max Kennedy, members of his family. Also Douglas Kennedy. These are two of the Kennedy cousins who were there as the remains of John Kennedy, his wife, and her sister Lauren Bissett were brought to shore on Thursday afternoon. These were probably the cousins who were closest to John Kennedy, Douglas and Max.
I thought I saw Laura going, the daughter who was going to be married.
Diane Sawyer of ABC, her husband, the movie producer Mike Nichols, director Mike Nichols.
You know, Jeff, as you were saying, death is very much on the minds of people throughout the city. I did some eavesdropping, moving around the city, the streets last night, of people talking, New Yorkers, out-of-towners, and one woman said, "I want to be cremated, but it's such an un-Catholic thing to do." They were discussing what happened yesterday at sea.
You know, I think there's just no way that this can happen without everybody reflecting on something that I think it's just a natural human condition to push away, and this brings it to our attention in a very powerful way. You can't ignore it. It's in every paper, it's on every television station. And as I say, when people turn out, even to stand across the street from the church, there's some way they're trying to connect up to an event, as if to say, well, I'm not completely powerless in the face of this. It's, I think, a very natural human condition, even without all the political overlay of the family and what's gone on the last 40 years.
Also joining us here in our New York studio as we watch preparations for this Mass at St. Thomas More Church is Edward Klein, a biographer of the Kennedy family. Ed Klein, as we watch these people go in, we've seen some people who have been close to the Kennedy family for decades. People like John Kenneth Galbraith, Arthur Schlesinger. Share with us, if you would, what the relationship is here.
These men, Galbraith, Schlesinger, Senator Ribicoff, who is now dead, Sorensen, these were the same men who Jackie would ask to come over to her apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue and give seminars to young John and Caroline Kennedy about their father and about his greatness and the legacy that he left behind. So these people are extremely meaningful to the Kennedy family.
They had stayed in touch. I read a piece that Mr. Schlesinger, Arthur Schlesinger wrote just a few days ago, and it was clear to me that he has stayed in touch with John Kennedy up until very recently.
Yes, he has, and in fact, he was very impressed by John Kennedy's involvement in many charitable causes that the public never knew about, because John Kennedy was involved in a very quiet, non-boastful way, which was his way of doing things, and Schlesinger was very impressed by that.
That's right. We're learning now that John Kennedy Jr. was involved in several programs to help poor children, to help children who were disabled or mentally retarded, and yet these were all things, as you point out, that were done outside the camera range. I don't think most of us were aware of these things. We knew that he was involved, for example, with the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. This was something that was passed on to him in his role as a, you know, the family, part of this family. But these other things were very much things he did on his own and because he wanted to do them.
That's right. And, you know, it's often been charged that John Kennedy Jr. was something of an exhibitionist. He took off his shirt in Central Park and was always being photographed by the paparazzi. But in fact, there was another very private side to him in which he did these good works very quietly.
You, in writing about the Kennedy family, I think you wrote more than once about the relationship between John Kennedy Jr. and his mother. And we've said it again and again these last few days. He was very much, for all the attention we're giving to the Kennedy family, he was very much his mother's son.
That's absolutely true. If anything, Jackie, I discussed this with Jackie a couple of times, she felt that Caroline was very focused and disciplined, and she didn't have to worry about her very much. But John, who was the apple of her eye, she felt was a little more distracted and a little spread apart. And so she was always concerned about John, who reminded her, I think, of her own father, Blackjack Bouvier, who was quite an impulsive sort of fellow, and her own husband, John Kennedy Sr.
Gary Tuckman is outside the church.
Well, Bernie, the security surrounding the church is intense and immense, and it's kept people away from seeing the church. However, on street corners all surrounding the area, you have groups of people gathered like the group behind me. About 50 people are standing, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything. Many of them very sad, and that's why they're here. Sir, first of all, your name?
Pedro Rivera.
Pedro, tell me why you decided to come out here today. You're not going to see very much.
I come to see because he was a gentleman. He liked children, with intelligence.
Okay, that's the reason this lady right next to you is telling me the same thing. Your name, ma'am?
Hi, my name is Jackie Tolkowski.
Jackie, you live in this neighborhood near where John F. Kennedy Jr. grew up. Tell me why you came out here today.
Because I'm very sad, and I think the country is very sad, and I wanted to pay my respects to my memories of the Kennedy family and to the legacy that JFK Jr. is leaving in America and to the world, even though his mission was incomplete. And it's just terrible that we have to have another Kennedy funeral as we face the new millennium, and that he wasn't able to move us forward in a way that would have galvanized the country and would have brought love and peace and respect and public service more to the forefront.
And thank you very much for your thoughts. We appreciate it. We expected to see hundreds, perhaps thousands of people in this neighborhood wanting to catch a glimpse of the memorial mass today, but because of the intense security, many people have stayed away. There was a public mass last night in New York City. There were literally 3,000 people in the streets, 1,000 people in the church about 4 miles south of here participating in the public mass, but in this private mass, the security is pretty tight. Bernie, back to you.
Thanks, Gary. Our viewers around the world have heard and seen Father John Gallen, the professor of liturgy. He rejoins us as we continue our special coverage. The President and Mrs. Clinton, we're told, are a few moments away, having arrived from Washington a short while ago at JFK International Airport and taking the Marine One chopper over to the area. Father Gallen, tell us about this Mass of the Resurrection.
Well, thank you, Bernie. The Mass that is being celebrated this morning is very much the same as the funeral Mass that would take place when the body of the deceased was present in the church with the gathered assembly. Everything that happens during this Mass is precisely and exactly the same. I think one thing that's quite characteristic of the Catholic funeral liturgy, if I were to find a word for it, is its realism. There is no denial of anything in this liturgy. The reality of death is embraced fully, and in all of its pain and all of its grief. But at the same time, the other piece of realism, and the predominating piece of realism, is the hope that we have in what the liturgy calls our sure and certain faith, that there is more than death, that death is a reality, but it is not the absolute, final, definitive reality. There is life as well, that death is transformed into life. As our liturgy says, life is changed, not taken away. So the emphasis, without ever suppressing the reality and suffering of death, the emphasis falls on the new life. It is the result of death transformation. One hears today the word celebratory Mass. I have the understanding that the Kennedy family has used that word very much to describe what's going on here today. It's because they have a sense, it is their faith that is so strong, that sees more than death, sees the life that wins out over death. And they wanted this Mass to be, as I understand their wishes, to be a celebratory Mass. Well, the liturgy is. They can trust in the liturgy to do that. It's all about life overcoming death.
Father, it's Jeff Greenfield. Can you tell us how that translates into some of the specific elements of the Mass? For instance, the vestments. Are they black? Are they other colors? Is the physical manifestation of this different than it might be in other faiths where the emphasis may well be on grief?
Well, Jeff, it has already been mentioned that the color white is predominant in the church interior today, and that's true of the vestments as well. While communities are quite at liberty to choose black vestments or purple vestments, white in our culture is a symbol of joy and varies from culture to culture. For example, in the Chinese culture, in my understanding, white tends to celebrate, tends to focus on grieving, but not in our culture. The color white in our culture signifies joy and rejoicing, and so for that reason, Father O'Byrne and the other priests concelebrating with him, Monsignor Benning, the pastor of the church, and Monsignor Bardas, the former pastor of the church, now retired, will all be wearing white vestments that contribute to that sense of joy and peace. Also, when the body is present, of course, and the coffin is brought to the door of the church, the coffin is met there, the body is met by the presiding ministers and is blessed, and a pall, that is to say, a white cloth that is meant to signify the white garment that the newly baptized receive as the water, as they come from the water of baptism that pall, that white cloth is placed over the garment to help people connect with the reality of baptism, which, like the Eucharist that is being celebrated today, focuses on the winning out of life over death, that death is transformed into a new life. There's a new creation, and that new creation is lived by them.
Father Dallin,
Yes.
We are going to interrupt you just a moment here. This is the motorcade bringing President Bill Clinton and First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, their daughter Chelsea. We were told that traveling with them from Washington on Air Force One is a member of the Kennedy family, the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Maryland, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, and her husband. We can watch now to see who emerges from this car. Jeff, we're told, and Bernie, we're told that the first family invited Lieutenant Governor Townsend and her husband David to fly with them to New York City. Kathleen Kennedy had been at the family compound last weekend to get ready for the celebration of her youngest sister's wedding. And we know what happened after that. Here we see First Lady Hillary Clinton, the President, their daughter Chelsea, and others entering the church.
And in a gesture to this family, the First Family has brought a photo album to give to the Kennedys. And we recall the President at his news conference this week indicating that, showing his appreciation for the personal tour he had received at the White House, John F. Kennedy Jr. sent the President an autographed picture, his favorite picture of his father, the late President Kennedy.
You know, Bernie and Judy, I suppose it wouldn't entirely be a Kennedy event, even a funeral, without mentioning a political dimension to this. There has been some talk about, because of Hillary Rodham Clinton's interest in a New York Senate seat, they are at the funeral. The governor of New York, the mayor of New York, who may be her opponent or not, because it's a private event. And I suppose to some extent there's an element of reassurance that even at this most solemn of moment, there are people looking for political portents in who is and who is not inside this church today.
Well, by their mere presence, statements are being made.
Well, with this family, there's always going to be a reading of the political tea leaves, if you will.
It's also a tradition, if you go back to Boston politics, there's a wonderful novel called The Last Hurrah by Edwin O'Connor, written in the early 50s about Boston politics, where at wakes, politics is always the principal source of conversation. And it is a way of reaffirming life in the presence of death. I mean, people may be offended in other cultures, but in fact, in many cultures, that's how you come to grips with death, is to turn toward the living and to the very secular business of office, even in the midst of grief. It may puzzle some people, but I think it's entirely natural.
Mm-hmm.
Our White House correspondent, John King, joins us from the White House. John, how did the President and the First Lady happen to be invited to this service?
They were told in a conversation with Senator Edward Kennedy and in a conversation the President had with Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg. The President said he would attend, but only if the family wanted him there. We're told both the Senator and John Kennedy Jr.'s sister Caroline expressed the will that they very much would like not only the President, but the First Lady and Chelsea Clinton to come. During her stops on Martha's Vineyard, we very rarely know much about Chelsea Clinton's travels. She goes off on her own, but we're told by aides and friends here that during her visits to Martha's Vineyard, she spent some time with John and Carolyn Kennedy, considered them friends, that they offered her advice on growing up in the public spotlight, the media spotlight. So the First Family invited today. The President has no speaking role. We're told he will just attend the ceremonies. Then he heads back to Washington. He did bring with him, we're told, a photo album he will present to the families. Most of the pictures in that album, we're told, from a March 1998 tour that he gave to John Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Kennedy Bissett. They were here at the White House for an event marking an HBO movie on the space program. John Kennedy spoke about his late father's role in pushing the United States to land on the moon. The President then gave them a very private, and we're told, personal tour of the White House residence, photos from that tour and from other
social events they attended here at the White House in an album the president will present to the families today.
John, your White House colleague, Chris Black, is at the church of Sir Thomas More. Chris, you are watching literally a parade of this Kennedy family. This is the sister of John Kennedy Jr., Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg, the older sister who is now the only surviving child of President John Kennedy, his wife, Jacqueline. She is walking into the church with her husband, Edwin Schlossberg. In fact, they were celebrating their 13th wedding anniversary this past Monday. At the same time, they were mourning the death of her younger brother. Chris Black.
Judy, Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg has probably had the worst loss of any member of the family. She was extremely close to her brother, and she is also one of the most private members of this very public family. I'm told that this service will very much bear her stamp. It has been her insistence that the service be held at St. Thomas More, a very small church, the Manhattan equivalent of a neighborhood church, if you will, where her mother, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, worshipped. So we will see that this will be more private than public, a celebration of the life of this very private but very public man. Judy?
Edward Klein, Kennedy biographer. Caroline occupies obviously the sole, she is the sole survivor of the President John Kennedy's family, Edward Klein, yes, and she has very much followed a path of her own making.
That's very true, Judy. You know, Caroline probably was more affected by her father's assassination than was John, who was really too young to remember it. In fact, Jackie told me that Caroline remembered everything and John remembered nothing. Caroline's first words of more than one syllable were Wisconsin, New Hampshire, and West Virginia, the states that her father was traveling in order to get the nomination of the Democratic Party. When he came home from his travels, he made up a story for Caroline, the president-to-be did, about a white shark that ate people's socks. And Caroline would say to her father, "Where's the shark, Daddy?" And he would say, "Oh, I think he's over there in the corner waiting for somebody's socks." They were very, very close. His death affected her profoundly, and I think shaped her character for the rest of her life.
She certainly has a strong passion and for privacy. In fact, she even wrote a book about the rights of privacy.
She wrote two books. She wrote one book called In Our Defense, the First Amendment in Action, and then a book called Privacy, Bernie, as you just said. And in both cases, I think the theme of the books, these two books, was the God-given right of people to control their own lives and not be manipulated by or intruded in by the media. I think she's put up as thick a wall as anybody we know, as any famous person we know, between herself and the media, and has in fact succeeded in living a relatively normal life as a mother and wife.
And yet, Ed, what's interesting to me is that it seemed that John Kennedy put up less of a wall than either his mother or sister. He seemed, the couple of times that I saw him, and what I hear is that he wore it with a little more sort of humor, irony. He knew that he was John Kennedy's son. He knew he was stared at every minute. But he seemed a little more willing to say, okay, I'll take that price. I'll be out in public. I will be part of New York's life. I will not pull back as much. Do you have that same sense that he was a little less, that wall was a little less high in his case?
I certainly do, Jeff. You know, it's instructive that John Kennedy seriously considered becoming an actor, and his mother put her foot down and told him, "You're not going to go into acting." But he had this desire to play a public role, to be seen by the public, and to receive back from the public the kind of love and affection that actors get. So I think he did make himself much more available than either his mother and certainly his sister.
Outside St. Thomas More Church, Gary Tuckman.
Well, Bernie, over the last 5 days, we've seen thousands of people on the streets of New York paying tribute to John Kennedy Jr. This is a new way of doing it. We haven't seen this yet. This is a children's violin group, the Tarumi Violin Children Foundation for the Arts from Queens, New York, playing mournful strains a block away from the church.
Father John Gallen, as we listen to these young violinists playing a short distance from the Church of St. Thomas More, again, a church with perhaps, I think we're told, 15 pews, holds maybe around 350 people. Tell us, if you will, the difference between a celebratory Mass, which is what will be observed this morning, and a funeral or a memorial Mass.
Well, Judy, there really is no difference at all. I think that that the word celebratory is being used by the Kennedy family quite appropriately to suggest that what the funeral liturgy really is about is a celebration of life that wins out over death. And so there really is no difference. It's simply a different word, but it does lay emphasis on the positive aspects of the Catholic funeral liturgy. The difference between a memorial Mass and an ordinary funeral Mass is simply that the remains of the deceased are not present at the memorial Mass, and so it's called that for that reason. It's interesting that there's something of also a coincidental historical connection between the use of this church, named after the British saint Thomas More, who was executed in 1535 because of conflict in his political position and his faith position. That age-old problem of church and state, if you like. Thomas More was the Lord Chancellor of England and got into a big conflict with the King, Henry VIII. and finally was executed because he held out in his faith belief, and it ended in his death. He's famous for a quote that he gave at the end: "I die as the king's true servant, but God's first." It makes us remember John Kennedy's challenge to be the first Catholic president, and he was asked properly and directly, does your Catholic faith put you in a bad position to be president of the United States? And he addressed that, I think many will remember, notably in his famous address in Houston, Texas, in which he said, "Not at all." Very kind of curiously coincidental that the Kennedy family is here today and has been in this church before. There's a whole long history of resolving that conflict and addressing it with bravery and courage.
Indeed. John King alerted us a short while ago from the White House that President Clinton bore very special mementos. John, back to you for some further detail.
Bernie, the president is carrying 3 copies of the same photo album. One, we're told, for Senator Edward Kennedy, another for Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg, and the third for the Bissett family. These a compilation of official White House photographs of occasions when John Kennedy and his wife Carolyn were here at the White House. Most of the photographs, we're told, from a March 1998 tour the president gave to John Kennedy and his wife. In there is one very interesting photograph of John Kennedy Jr., his chin resting in his hand, gazing up at a portrait of his late father, the president, in which President Kennedy's chin is resting in his hand. We're told a number of other photographs in this album that the president will present both to the senator, to Caroline Kennedy, and to the Bissett family, his gift to them at this memorial service, an invitation-only event here at the St. Thomas More Church. The president brought a few close friends of the Kennedy family with him on Air Force One, including Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, Andrew Cuomo, the Housing Secretary, who was married to one of the late Senator Robert Kennedy's daughters, Kerry Kennedy Cuomo, also the Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle, and Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut, a very close friend of Senator Kennedy. Here you see the photograph here, Bernie. This is one of the photographs of the 3 of them, Carolyn Kennedy Bissett and John Kennedy Jr., glancing up at the portrait of President Kennedy. We're told there is a more intimate photograph in the album of just John Kennedy Jr. gazing at that same portrait.
John, we're going to go back to Chris Black outside the church.
Bernie, the music at this service will very much be music that reflects the life and loves of John Kennedy Jr. Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg was very intent upon making sure that this Mass of the Resurrection reflected the best of her brother. An ad hoc gospel choir, O Freedom, a group from here in New York, will be performing during the service. And a former member of the Fugees, a hip-hop rock group, Wycliffe Jean, will be doing a solo. Less than 2 years ago, at the funeral of his cousin Michael, Andy Williams sang Ave Maria, and that again was because Andy Williams was a very close friend of Ethel Kennedy, Michael Kennedy's mother. At this service, we will have this gospel choir, O Freedom, and Wycliffe Jean, who are said to reflect the interests of John Kennedy Jr. Bernie?
Chris Black outside this edifice. Jeff Greenfield.
It's my memory that in 1968, Andy Williams sang at Robert Kennedy's funeral, and at the time wanted to sing, Ethel Kennedy wanted him to sing Ave Maria, and the powers that be said, no, that's an inappropriate song for this occasion. He wound up singing the battle hymn of the Republic. So I guess these details really involve family preferences, church preferences. I mean, it's one of those parts in which life goes on, no matter how solemn the occasion is, that you have these questions of what's appropriate to be sung, who should be doing it. But I take it that at this event, Ave Maria is going to be sung.
We are just apparently a minute or 2 away from when this Mass is scheduled to begin. Again, no cameras, no sound. We won't be inside the church, nor will any member of the news media, as far as we know, be inside. A note on Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis' funeral a few years ago. At that service, invitations were hand-delivered. Guests had to show these invitations at several security checkpoints approaching the church in New York City, St. Ignatius Loyola, a church on Park Avenue. No cameras, just one print reporter who was admitted on the condition that he sit in the last pew and speak to no one. Now, we, at this point, have no idea if there has been an arrangement, such an arrangement made with a reporter, print or otherwise, but a reflection that this is a family determined to preserve privacy.
And Judy, also at the Jacqueline Onassis Kennedy funeral, sound audio was permitted, and we were able to hear the service, but that will not be the case, as you indicated here today.
Presiding, Father Charles O'Byrne, who also was the priest who married John Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette almost 3 years ago in September of 1996 in another very private ceremony on a small island off the coast of Georgia, Cumberland Island. And I would just ask Father John Gowan, you know Father O'Byrne, what is his relationship with John Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette?
Well, it's true, Judy. Father O'Byrne and I are both Jesuit priests, and again, by coincidence, we live in the same Jesuit community in New York City. It's called America House, where the Jesuit magazine America is edited every week. Father O'Byrne and I are good friends, and we talked this morning, and I know that Father O'Byrne's attitude was very much celebratory, full of grief, of course, but at the same time recognizing the predominance of life over death. And that attitude of his is what he brings to the celebration of the liturgy today. I'm sure the whole family will be inspired by the kind of thing that he's brought. He was a school chum, law school it was, with one of the Kennedys, Steve, and that's where they got to be good friends, and that friendship brought him into a relationship with the whole family, and he and John became quite good friends, and as you pointed out, he presided at the marriage of John and Carolyn in Georgia almost 3 years ago.
Father Galen, it's Jeff Greenfield. You were mentioning a while ago the symbolism that this is a church named after Thomas More, who sort of symbolized a conflict between faith and the secular state. And it's worth remembering that when John Kennedy ran for president, that whole question among some people was very much up in the air about whether a Catholic president could serve his country first. And I'm thinking back, that was also the time not only of John Kennedy, but of John the 23rd, and how different the whole assumption is about the role of a Catholic president. When Robert and Ted Kennedy ran for president, I don't think the religious issue was ever given 5 seconds of thought, because things had changed so much from John Kennedy's day.
Jeff, you have a very good memory, and your raising up of the image of John the 23rd really is very appropriate. John the 23rd brought an attitude to the church that helped to expand and broaden people's vision about what spiritual life was about and what spiritual life in the church was about. He was fully a person of the tradition, but he tried to point out to everyone that the tradition was perhaps a little bit larger than we were always remembering. The question, the challenge of reconciling church-state is very real, and understandably so. It was addressed very eloquently not very long ago by the Catholic former governor of New York, Governor Mario Cuomo. He gave an eloquent address trying to point out the elements of the question. And John Kennedy did the same in Houston while he was running for president.
Our thanks to our viewers around the world who are joining CNN's live coverage. You are looking at the exterior of St. Thomas More Church. Outside, CNN correspondent Chris Black.
Bernie, the Kennedy and Bissett Freeman families are very intent that this be a celebration of the lives of John and Carolyn Kennedy. When John Jr. was alive, he and his sister Caroline frequently would mark significant events on their father's birthday rather than on the day he died. This is very characteristic of the family. They do, as Father Gallen said, as religious Catholics, believe in eternal life. And today, as they celebrate in this small church where Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis worshipped, before an altar which is decorated with white flowers, roses and lilies of the valley, they hope to celebrate the lives of these two people they lost. Bernie?
Does it appear that most of the special people invited to this service have entered the church?
It does seem that we're getting very close, Bernie, and it's also important to note that these people who came here today all had some connection, some special connection to either John or Carolyn Kennedy. Carolyn Kennedy Schlossberg was very intent that this be as private and normal a memorial mass as possible, and that people who came here have some connection with John. He did not hold public office. He was not a public official, and indeed he, though was treated frequently as a public figure, both John and Caroline were famous simply because they were Kennedys from the time they were born, not necessarily because of anything they did. And throughout their lives, they frequently found it difficult to find privacy. Bernie?
Thank you. Chris Black.
Edward Klein, biographer of the Kennedy family, joining us now. You know, Chris is talking about their seeking of privacy, and yet they were so very public. There was no way they could, even at the moments of greatest publicity and public presence, if you will, they had to be still seeking at least a moment of privacy, didn't they?
Well, you know, I was struck by Chris Black's phrase, private and normal. This tension inside the family between the private and the public can be traced all the way back to 1953 when Joseph P. Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, insisted that there be a huge wedding between his sons, who he wanted to run for president, and Jackie Bouvier. And Jackie Bouvier's stepfather, Hugh D. Auchincloss, wanted to give the wedding at his estate in Newport for 200 or 300 people, a small wedding. Joe sent his wife, Rose, to see Hugh D. Auchincloss, and at that time, she laid down the law. My husband insists that this be a huge wedding, that the press be invited, that every senator and every congressman be invited. And in fact, Joe paid for the wedding, and thousands of people showed up. And it was the most public of kind of weddings, and it was very much against the Bouvier-Auchincloss tradition, this ideal which is to live a private life. So this push-pull has been in effect for the last 40 or 50 years in this family.
I could make a comment also.
We have some pictures that we want to show you. People arriving at St. Thomas More Church over the last hour, including Caroline Kennedy, the sister of John Kennedy Jr., daughter of the president. This is Caroline arriving about 20 minutes ago or so with her husband, Edwin Schlossberg.
There is Senator Edward Kennedy. He will be one of two eulogists at this service, which was scheduled to begin at 11 a.m. Eastern.
Lee Radziwill, sister of the late Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, aunt of John Kennedy and Caroline. Robert Kennedy Jr., son of Robert, the Attorney General, cousin to John Kennedy Jr.
As we watch these tape pictures, John F. Kennedy Jr.'s early life as a toddler in the White House put him very much in the public eye and the public's hearts. For many, the images from that era bring to mind a unique moment in this great nation's history, a time of innocence and seemingly unlimited optimism. Here's CNN David Inser.
When he was born in November 1960, his father had just been elected president. Less than 2 months later, John F. Kennedy took office.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
For the first time since 1893, an infant lived in the White House. There were children on the loose.
It livened up the place instantly. The children dashing off to play out on the lawn.
Letitia Baldridge was Jacqueline Kennedy's social secretary at the White House.
They would streak by, and of course they just made everyone so happy, laughing. Oh, there's John, there's Caroline, roaring with laughter and realizing this was a house with children.
But the First Lady worried that her children couldn't have a normal childhood if they became too famous. So she fought for a measure of privacy.
There were journalists that wanted to photo them, and Jackie was in touch with me practically every day saying, stop it, stop it, stop it.
Pierre Salinger was President Kennedy's press secretary.
But this was something that John Kennedy had a different view. You know, when Jackie would go away, you know, he called me in, he said, now we want to do these photos. We want these photos done in my room, in my office, because I think these photos will be very important for the kids.
And important for what became known as Camelot, the brief, shining moment of youth and glamour that was the Kennedy presidency. As captured by look photographer Stanley Tretic, the president's desk was a playhouse for John Jr. Even as Kennedy, Salinger, and others worried about the Berlin crisis, there were children underfoot. Cecil Stoughton was the official White House photographer, whose pictures ran in almost every major American publication.
On one particular occasion, I was sitting outside of his office, and I heard this noise. He was clapping, sitting by his desk clapping, and the kids were dancing, performing for him, yet trying to outdo each other in their pirouettes and steps and bouncing around. And so I snapped off a series of 12 pictures at that time.
Stoughton, or a colleague, were always there to capture the many spontaneous moments.
This was in the evening, Halloween evening, and the president's still working at his desk. Then all of a sudden through the door comes these two little monsters. One's a little monster and one's a little witch.
And though the president adored his daughter Caroline, there was a special kind of male bonding with his namesake son.
I think it was a mirror reflecting a mirror. I think John Kennedy Sr. was looking at that little boy so full of love and pride, and his son looked back at him in the same way. They had a very close relationship.
The home movies, released years later, capture more of that same intimacy. For 3 precious years, the formative years, say the experts, John F. Kennedy Jr. had a father. And in the summer of 1963, there was something to look forward to as well. A new sibling was on the way.
I think they were thrilled about it, and they saw their mother's tummy growing, and they knew all about it.
But Brother Patrick died within days.
And I'm sure they were terribly sad, but children get over things. Little children get over things a lot better than older children do.
Today, we live in a time when streets next to the White House must be blocked off to protect against truck bombs. What's easy to forget is how different Washington was back then, before President Kennedy was assassinated, how different the nation was. Back when Caroline Kennedy was in ballet class at this school with my sister, there was a feeling of safety and innocence. One day my mother drove up here in her car and opened the front door for my little sister. Instead, a boy got in. Quickly retrieved by the Secret Service, he was John Kennedy Jr.
It was a much nicer, easier time, and a very romantic time. I miss the grace of the period, how polite people were, how life was much more serene.
A lot of that ended on that day in Dallas.
Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
The nation, some said, lost its innocence. John Kennedy Jr. lost his father. He'd been taught how to salute by a military man, and thus, the most unforgettable image.
Do you remember that? I think that what happens is that you see an image so many times that you sort of begin to remember the image, but I'm not sure I really do.
That day, the day of the salute, happened to be John Jr.'s 3rd birthday. And despite it all, his mother was determined that he should have a party upstairs at the White House.
When it was all over and the last limousine had pulled away, she went upstairs and they had a little private party with her boy.
I think that the most important thing is what happened 2 days after John Kennedy was assassinated. Jackie suddenly came into my office, and she said, Pierre, there's only one thing in the world I can do now. I've got to take care of these kids, and I've got to make sure that they do well. If I don't do that, they'll only be thinking about their father's death, and this is something that I've got to do.
There was one more unforgettable image in the White House years. Cecil Stoughton was there.
The last day of walking out of the White House with his mom, hand in hand. Great picture. Glad I was there.
From that time in 1963 until this day in 1999 spans 35 years in the life of a young man, John Kennedy, Jr.
Kennedy biographer Ed Klein, after watching and listening to David Inser's piece, I want to ask you, what were some of the flashbacks as we enjoyed this report?
You know, I was thinking as we watched this report that John Kennedy Sr. was 39 years old when he appeared before the Democratic National Convention to place his name before the vice presidency. And from that day on, at the age of 39, he began running for because he didn't get the vice presidency, he began running for president. And John Kennedy Jr., of course, was short only 1 year of 39. And here he was approaching the age in which his father's greatness began to take shape. And it must have been on his mind a great deal in these last few years that time, as well as the pressure of the public, would come to bear upon him in such a way that he'd have to make a major decision, crossroads in his life, whether to continue with George magazine, which, as we know, was not terribly successful, or to really step forward, as everyone expected he would, and take a public role and run for office. And I think this must have been very much on his mind in the last few months before his death.
Of course, we'll never know, but what did you think he might do?
I personally thought that he would eventually go into politics. I think he's given us a lot of hints that he was thinking in those directions. He said that a lot of early life was preparation for later life. I think he was thinking about the fact that that he had to prove himself first, that living under the shadow of the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States, and of course, you know, not only politically powerful, but we've not mentioned this yet today, but all these lurid stories about President Kennedy and his sexual exploits. These were facts that John Kennedy Jr. had to cope with. And how does a son who naturally wants to exceed his father in life, how does a son exceed a father like John Kennedy? That was the great dilemma of his life.
Chris Black, I know you've done some thinking about what the rest of the family, what friends of John Kennedy thought his intentions were.
Well, Ed is absolutely right, Judy, that John Kennedy Jr. spent much of his life trying to come to terms with the incredible legacy he inherited. He was named after his father, and this is a very political family. His cousins, the Robert F. Kennedy cousins, are extremely political, and there was a lot of pressure on him to seek public office at some point. He, in fact, got on the political track. He went to law school. He was a prosecutor here in Manhattan, which is the career track that his Uncle Ted followed in Boston before he ran for the United States Senate. But at the same time, as I'm sure Ed Klein can attest to, his mother always told John Jr. and Caroline that they were their own people, they were unique individuals, they should do what they wanted. And I found it interesting that John actually became a spectator of politics as the editor of George magazine rather than an active participant. We'll never know whether he would have sought public office, though he was beginning to become more and more interested in political life. I know several conversations I had with John Jr. last fall when I was still a newspaper reporter before I came to CNN. President Clinton was on the verge of being impeached, and John Jr. would often call me in the Senate press gallery to talk about politics. Just ask me what's going on, what's really going to happen, what does this mean? And it was, I could sense, as somebody who's been a sort of political junkie most of her life, that this was a guy who was sort of coming to politics a little later. He was asking questions that somebody who was as much a junkie as I would not have asked necessarily, but he clearly was becoming more and more interested. His magazine was all about politics, and it may be that he would have made that step and at some point sought political office himself. Judy, Bernie?
Chris, he said in an interview, this was 6 years ago, in an interview with Vogue magazine, he said, once you run for office, you're in it, sort of like going into the military. You better be damn sure that it's what you want to do and that the rest of your life is set up to accommodate that. He went on, he said, it takes a certain toll on your personality and on your family life. I've seen it personally, so if I were to do it, I'd want to make sure that that was what I wanted to do and that I didn't do it because people thought I should. But as you say, that was 6 years ago. There are a number of indications that in the years since then, he did begin to think somewhat more seriously about it. New Jersey Democratic Senator Bob Torricelli has said in the last few days that he called John Kennedy twice last fall to ask him if he'd consider running for Pat Moynihan's Senate seat in New York. And both times he said John Kennedy said no, but he said not now. He didn't say never. Chris?
Judy, there was definitely ambivalence in the baby boom generation, the generation of the children of John, Robert, and Edward Kennedy about seeking political office. These children saw the sacrifice that they paid for public office. The assassinations of John and Robert Kennedy seared every one of these children. They were devastating losses. So there was some natural reluctance to seek the public forum. I am reminded that John Jr.'s remarks in that magazine interview from 6 years ago were very similar to something Joe II said to me years before he sought office, before he ran for Congress, a couple of years before he ran for Congress in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I did an interview with him for the Boston Globe, ran on the front page, in which he said, oh, I'm not going to run for public office. It's a great pit of molasses. A wonderful image that actually haunted him when he later did seek public office. But I also remember that after that interview ran, his sister Kathleen told me that the entire family was laughing hysterically about it because there was no doubt in their minds that Joe II would seek public office. Judy and Bertie?
Yeah, it's Jeff Greenfield, Chrissy, because for all that ambivalence, we look at the next generation. You have, as you pointed out, you have Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, a likely candidate for governor of Maryland. You have Patrick Kennedy, son of Ted, who's in the Congress already. You have Joe, who's just stepped down, but who may well be back. One of the Shrivers is a state representative. Robert Kennedy Jr., an environmental lawyer in New York, clearly has a political future if he wants it. It also occurred to me something that Ed Klein said that I think is really quite striking, and that is because of what happened to the elder Kennedys, the generations collapse. We don't think of John Kennedy as someone who would have been 82 years old today, a more contemporary of Ronald Reagan. We think of him as that young, vital man. Robert Kennedy would have been in his mid-70s now had he lived. We don't think of him that way. We think of him as that 43-year-old in 1968. And to an extent, the father and the son and the uncle all seem to be of the same sort of youth and vitality because the lives of the elders were so cut short as John's was. They will never grow old out of memory. They can't.
Well, Jeff, you know, the central ethos in this family, I think, can be expressed best in a sentence from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. He said, "On earth, God's works must truly be our own." These are people who are raised to do something, to make a difference, to contribute. That is the way they translate their Catholic faith into their secular lives. So there's a lot of responsibility, a sense of duty in this family to make a difference, to do something. If you're a lawyer, you do environmental law, or as Teddy Jr. does, Senator Kennedy's son, he does litigation that helps the handicapped. They try to make the world a better place, and frankly feel pretty guilty if they don't, because this is how they were raised. This is very much part of their lives. Bernie and Judy?
Among the 300 some odd people inside attending this private celebratory mass, the President of the United States And back at the White House before he left, the president packed some items to bring up to New York City. John King, you took us through a couple pages. Back to you for more.
Bernie, we can show you a few of the photographs in an album. The president is carrying 3 identical photo albums, one for Senator Edward Kennedy, we're told, one for Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg, and one for the Bassett family. We can show you some of the photographs in here, a rare glimpse of the president's private study in the residence. This outside here, obviously looking at a portrait of the late President John Kennedy. We're told in this album are much more intimate shots as well. Those 3 photographs all have been released publicly. We're told in this album some more intimate shots of the tour the president gave John Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bassett Kennedy when they were here at the White House in March 1998. Also some other photographs. They were here twice for state dinners. We're told the president will present those albums today to the family members. And before the president headed up to New York, Bernie, he ordered the flags over the White House residence here flown at half-staff in honor of the victims of this tragic plane crash. The president, the First Lady, Chelsea Clinton, in attendance at the service now underway at the St. Thomas More Church. They have no speaking role. The president will return to Washington after the service is complete, although we are told he does look forward to some private moments with members of both families.
Thank you, John King.
And as we listen to what the president brought there, we are seeing a picture of his presidential limousine parked just outside the Church of St. Thomas More on 89th Street in Upper Manhattan. John Kennedy Jr.'s life, of course, a life of privilege and a life of pain, a life lived much of the time in the public eye. But there was a personal side to the man known when he was much younger as John John. CNN's Candy Crowley now on JFK Jr.'s private years.
He was the world's most famous 3-year-old, a child of extraordinary circumstance, for whom his mother wanted an ordinary life.
She took those 2 children to New York. She tried to build them as private a life as they could and as different a life. I think she felt they didn't have to gravitate into politics.
In the early days, it was rare to see one without the other. Daughter and mother, son and mother, mother and daughter and son. It's been the 3 of us for so long, 26-year-old John once said. Mommy, me, and Caroline.
His mother was very protective of him and didn't allow him or let him much out of her sight in his early years. And, of course, he had the nannies to take care of him.
It is easy to look back now and see when lifelong passions begin to burn, for the sea and for the air. And were that not astronaut John Glenn at his side, and were that not his ever-recognizable mother teaching him to ski, the archives of John Kennedy's life would look much like so many other American scrapbooks.
Queen Elizabeth escorts Mrs. John F. Kennedy and her children.
But an ordinary life is a sometime thing when the initials are JFK. There were memorials to his father to dedicate and ships to be christened. It's said that Uncle Bobby, that's him there beneath all the children, John at the lower right, was the one who began the task of teaching a fatherless child about being a man.
Now it's on to Chicago and let's win there.
Robert Kennedy died when John was 7. If they're killing Kennedys, Jackie is reported to have said, then my children are targets. 4 months later, she married Aristotle Onassis, a Greek shipping tycoon 29 years her senior. America did not like the Lady of Camelot running off to another country, and it was easy to read disapproval into the bowed head of John as he acquired a stepfather he always called Mr. Onassis. There were exotic summers from Greece to Monte Carlo, but it was back to New York in the fall for the school year.
John was a typical kid. I remember very clearly he would on occasion forget his work.
One of John's teachers at Collegiate Elementary School remembers the night his phone rang.
On our kitchen phone from the ship-to-shore operator, and it was John's mother telling me that she had read him the riot act and he would certainly have his homework for me the next day.
The pictures hint of a free spirit in the making, a kid who liked to shake the Secret Service when he could. His code name was Lark, a kid who loved karate so much he hated the interruption of vacation.
And his mother would send me notes saying that, you know, he was very upset to have to miss, but could I please tell him it was okay, so he would go on vacation and not be grumpy.
There were trips to the Kennedy family compound as well, but not for long summer months. Jackie wanted some separation from her son, and the family that shared his name.
As he grew older, she kept him a little sheltered and away from the rest of the Kennedy children.
In his late teens, John's summers were carefully scheduled by his mother, including a stint in Guatemala providing earthquake relief.
He was usually not around the other kids until like Labor Day or the end of the summer.
As John Jr. approached adolescence, Jackie asked old friends to give the children memories of a father they barely knew.
So this was something that got them into a brain very, very strongly, and particularly with John Jr. He started to thinking about, well, this is something that my father did, and maybe I've got to do something with the kind of thing that my father did.
The year Caroline graduated from high school, Aristotle Onassis died. The family returned to New York, and within a year, John was at the prestigious Phillips Academy in Andover.
I remember he joined our stickball league and was on our stickball team, which is sort of just a fun athletic event after dinner every night here on the Great Lawn. And he made up T-shirts that said, God, family, school, stickball across the back.
He had to repeat junior year after flunking math. His passions were theater and athletics.
He was a good, solid, average, liberal-hearted, free-thinking, smiling young man who did too much weightlifting and too much acting in high school to really get great grades. And I used to abuse him for that in a kind of witty way.
John chose Brown for college, a telling decision for a family with deep Harvard roots. And Jackie, it seems, had raised the son she wanted.
The remarkable fact about him was that he was so unremarkable in that way. I mean, he was very easygoing and very comfortable to be around. So you didn't get this sense, oh, you know, I'm around John Kennedy Jr., the son of one of the best presidents, if not the best president, that this country has ever had.
At Brown, he dabbled in Shakespeare, still drawn to the stage.
My call is to the young in heart.
But the siren call of his legacy was never far from the world he inhabited. In October of '79, they dedicated the JFK Library.
Born of the sun, they traveled a short while towards the sun, and left the vivid air sun with their honor.
And in the summer of his 20th year, John F. Kennedy Jr. returned to Washington, D.C. to work as an intern for a liberal think tank.
He was torn at that time between a career in public life and a career in theater or maybe the arts.
It's said that Jackie put the kibosh on a life in the theater. Still, as late as 1988, John took a part in a film produced by a friend.
What does it matter what we do when we're not together? When we're together, you know, we're really together.
Graduation from Brown in '83 was followed by 3 years of global roaming. In '86, JFK enrolled in New York University Law School. A law degree is a staple of political life. That same year, Caroline was married. The inseparable trio, Mommy, me, and Caroline, were on different tracks. Caroline moving deeper into a private world. John further into the public domain.
Thank you very much.
The stage he played on was the 1988 Democratic Convention, his national political debut.
So many of you came into public service because of him. In a very real sense, because of you, he is with us still.
Old friends of his dad began to dream again.
I said, you know, what you did was so good. You've got to now think about the possibility of going into politics. He said, you know, I've got an idea. I think I'll do some politics in the next century. I'm thinking of running for the Senate in 2004 or 2006.
His ease in front of the camera, his casual acceptance of the Klieg lights had winner written all over it. But Jackie had raised a rebel, her poetry in his soul, his father's politics in his blood. With a law degree in hand and a set of magic initials, John F. Kennedy Jr. was launched into the world, the 3-year-old of extraordinary circumstance, had become a young adult with extraordinary opportunities. Candy Crowley, CNN, Washington.
Some remarkable images there, and again a picture of St. Thomas More Church, Upper Manhattan, where services are perhaps half an hour now in and underway, services to celebrate the lives of John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. Edward Klein, biographer of the Kennedys, I'm struck again and again as I see these pieces, including the one we just saw put together by Candy Crowley, of how determined his mother was to keep him separated for significant periods of his life from the rest of the Kennedy family. Why did she feel so strongly about that?
You know, 1 week after the assassination of President Kennedy, Jackie took John to see the famous child psychoanalyst Eric Erikson, and she told him, more than anything else, I want life to go on as normally as possible for my children. And that was the great theme of her mothering for the next 15 or 20 years. It strikes me as a little ironic in some respects that between the ages of 8 and 15, when John really sort of came of age, Jackie was married to Aristotle Onassis. And despite the fact that John was not very happy about that marriage at first, he and Onassis actually began to form quite a strong bond. And Onassis used to take John on his Piaggio seaplane from the island of Scorpios to Athens for excursions in Athens. He also gave him a red speedboat, and they became quite close friends. And I think that Onassis and Onassis's attitudes had some effect upon John, especially the adventuresome aspect of Onassis.
But you say she wanted him to lead as normal a life as possible. Why wouldn't it have been entirely normal for him to stay in more regular contact with his father's family?
Oh, I think she consciously tried and successfully succeeded in keeping John and Caroline away during those long summer months from the Kennedy clan in Hyannisport. That was the last thing she wanted her children to be involved in. She felt that they were so competitive that, you know, whoever scored the latest touchdown was going to be president of the United States. This was not the kind of life, the pressurized kind of life, the overly competitive kind of life that she wanted for her children.
Father John Gallen, how did Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis instill in her two children a personal faith so that it would not just be a family hand-me-down, if you will?
I think that the reason we're at St. Thomas More Church today is some witness to that faith. Jackie Kennedy was a regular participant in the Catholic liturgy, particularly the celebration of the Catholic Eucharist. And the whole focus of that Eucharist is what's going on right now in the church. It's got two parts to it. The Word of God that we listen to, the story of how God is present in our lives, and secondly, the meal of Jesus, which we go on to celebrate in our time, faithful to Jesus' own mandate, do this in memory of me. This was the life of Jackie Kennedy. She was there again and again and again. And that was at the heart and center of her own faith life, very obviously. And so we're there again today. It was the church where she celebrated the Eucharist on a continual basis, and we must understand that, like all the rest of her attitude, that is what she brought to her children. When John Kennedy became a young man, I can only conclude that when he discovered Charles O'Byrne, this Jesuit priest, he found in Charles that same kind of faith, mature, intellectual, articulate, reflective, not naive. That to me is a sure witness and sign that what Jackie Kennedy instilled in her son took root.
We cannot hear what is going on within the walls of this revered church, but your friend, Father Charles O'Byrne, is the presiding priest at this celebratory Mass. You spoke with him earlier today. What did he say he wanted to achieve this morning for everyone assembled?
When we spoke early this morning, and when we finished, he went uptown and I went downtown. I came down to CNN and he went to St. Thomas More. I used the word before that the family was using. He was celebratory. He was fully involved in what that Catholic liturgy does. That is to say, in this proclamation of the Word, the first part of the Mass, the stories from Scripture, they're very, very interesting from this point of view, that what we do when we listen to those stories is hear how God has moved in the lives of people before us, but the point of it is to see that those stories are likewise our stories. And Father O'Byrne has as a challenge at the end of that storytelling to give the homily. And what the homily is about, really, is connecting the dots. It's trying to help all of us who listen to those stories see that the stories are not only the stories of those people then, they are, but they're also stories of ourselves today. And that's what he's busy doing right now. He's trying to show that, for example, a typical reading at a Catholic funeral mass or memorial mass is taken from the Jewish scripture, the book of Job, in which the great affirmation is, I know that my Redeemer lives, and I know that with my own eyes I shall see God. My inmost being is consumed with longing. Father O'Byrne is addressing that human longing inside that church this morning.
Father Gellin, it's exactly the point I was hoping that you could help us understand about a belief system. Rose Kennedy has once told someone after John Kennedy was killed, she had been angry with him about something, and she's said to have said, when I see him, I'm going to give him a piece of my mind. I mean, a sense that in a very literal way, they were going to meet again. Is this something that each person defines differently, or is there some central faith in the Catholic Church that indeed they will be together in some sense that we can understand and comprehend for eternity?
Yes, there is.